The message arrived at 3:00 in the morning station time. Ambassador Lena Vasquez was asleep in her quarters. Aboard the Meridian Arc, a diplomatic station that floated in orbit around a neutral world at the edge of Concord space, she had spent the evening negotiating trade routes with a species that communicated through color changes in their skin, and she was exhausted when her personal terminal began screaming with a priority alert. She thought it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. The message was short. It was written in 3 human languages at once: ancient Mandarin, Latin, and Swahili, layered on top of each other, like a code that only someone who understood humanity's deepest roots could have written. No alien species in the galactic Concord used those languages. Most did not even know they existed. The translation was simple: the Vrathi Dominion has broken the pale boundary. They are coming for the Hearthworlds. You have 19 cycles. This is the only mercy we can offer. Lena read it 3 times, then she read it again. Her hands were shaking, not because she did not understand the words, but because she understood them perfectly. The Varathi were a name that most species in the Concord spoke only whispers. They were an insected empire of billions, a civilization that did not trade, did not negotiate, and did not stop. They consumed world after world, system after system. They stripped everything down to bare rock and moved on. For thousands of years they had been locked behind the pale boundary, an ancient energy barrier that stretched across an entire region of the galaxy. Nobody knew who had built it. Nobody knew how it worked, but everyone knew what it kept inside. If the boundary had fallen, there was nothing between the Vathi and the Hearthworlds, the population centers of over 60 species, including every major human colony. Lena contacted Admiral Kale Marrero within the hour. Marrero was a tall, quiet man in his 60s with gray hair and calm eyes that never seemed to blink. He had served in the United Terran Armada for 30 years, and for most of that time the galaxy had considered him a desk officer, a man who managed patrol routes and signed paperwork. The galaxy was wrong about that. Marrero listened to the message without interrupting. When Lena finished, he asked only one question: who sent it? The answer took another 2 hours to confirm. The signal had been routed through 17 dead relay stations, bounced off the surface of a collapsed star, and encrypted in a mathematical language that human computers could barely process. But when the decryption was complete, the origin was unmistakable. The message had come from the Aether, were ancient, not old in the way that some conquered species were old. The Ether were ancient in a way that made other civilizations look like children. They had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. They had stopped communicating with the rest of the galaxy over 6,000 years ago. They watched, they observed, they said nothing until now. The fact that the Ether had broken their silence was by itself the most terrifying event. Living memory, it meant that whatever was coming was bad enough to make a species that had ignored the galaxy for 6 millennia decide that someone needed to be warned, and they had chosen to warn the humans. Marrero did not waste time wondering why. He opened a secure channel to Earth, one that used communication systems the Conquered did not know existed, and he spoke 4 words to the Terran Council: activate Project Ember. The council session that Followed was the most intense in human history, representatives from every colony, every station, every outpost, argued and shouted and demanded explanations. Some wanted to bring the warning to the conquered and let the alliance handle it. Others wanted to evacuate. A few wanted to pretend the message was a fake and go back to sleep. But Admiral Marrero stood before them and laid out the truth in plain language. The conquered's military, the shield phalanx, was a peacekeeping force. It was large, yes, but it was designed to break up border disputes between member species, not to fight a total war against the Varathi. If the conquered tried to organize a defense through its normal channels, committees, votes, jurisdictional arguments, the Varathi would reach the hearthworlds before the first resolution was passed. Humanity had known this for a long time. That was why Project Ember existed. 200 years ago, when humanity first joined the conquered, its leaders had smiled and nodded and signed the treaties. They had presented themselves as traders, engineers, and diplomats. They had built a small, visible fleet of patrol ships and border frigates, just enough to meet the conquered minimum requirements, and then quietly in the dark spaces between stars where no one ever looked, they had begun building something else. Project Ember was humanity's real fleet. It was hidden in deep space shadow docks scattered across 7 uninhabited systems, far from any trade route or sensor grid. For 2 centuries, humanity had studied every war in galactic history, every species, weapons and tactics, every victory and every defeat. They had taken the best ideas from all of them, snorts, combined technologies that no single species had ever thought to merge, and built warships that were designed for one purpose: to fight a war that could end everything. 3,200 ships, not patrol boats, not frigates, battle cruisers, carrier dreadnoughts, siege platforms, stealth destroyers, and 12 massive super carriers, each 5 km long, designated the extinction class. They carried weapons that the galaxy had never seen, in crews that had trained in secret for their entire lives. The vote was unanimous. Project Ember was activated, and in the black emptiness between the stars, in places where no light had shone for millions of years, something began to change. A single light appeared, small, blue and steady. Then another, then a dozen, then 100, then 1,000. Ship after ship powered up its engines. For the very first time, navigation systems calculated jump coordinates. Weapon systems ran through their activation sequences. Crews who had been born, raised, and trained in hidden stations took their positions and waited for the order. Admiral Marrero stood on the bridge of the dreadnought UTAS Prometheus and looked at the tactical display. 3,200 green icons filled the screen, each one representing a warship that the galaxy did not know existed. He opened a channel to the entire fleet. His voice was steady. All ships, this is Admiral Marrero. The enemy is real. The threat is confirmed. You have trained for this your entire lives, and I will not lie to you. What is coming will be the hardest thing any of us has ever faced, but we did not build this fleet to hide. We built it to fight, and today we fight. He paused. All ships engage. Drives, set course for the hearthworlds. We have 19 cycles, and I intend to be early. The fleet jumped. 3,200 ships vanished into faster than light travel, in perfect unison, leaving behind Nothing but empty space and silence. The galaxy did not know it yet, but everything was about to change. The galactic Concord learned about the pale boundaries collapsed 12 hours after humanity did. The news spread like fire. Through dry grass, long-range sensor posts along the Concord outer border detected the energy signature first, a massive disruption in the space where the boundary had stood for thousands of years. Within hours, scout ships confirmed the worst. The boundary was gone, not weakened, not flickering. Gone, and through the gap where it had once stood, a darkness was moving. Sensors picked up ship signatures in numbers that made no sense. 40,000. 50,000. The count kept climbing. The Vrathe were coming. The Conquered response was exactly what Admiral Marrero had predicted. Panic, confusion, paralysis. The Shield Phalanx, the Alliance's joint military force, was large on paper, over 10,000 ships from dozens of species, but it had never fought a real war. Its admirals argued over command structures. Its politicians demanded emergency sessions. 3 species withdrew their fleets entirely, pulling them back to protect their own home worlds and leaving gaps in the defensive line. Evacuation orders went out across the hearthworlds. Billions of civilians from dozens of species scrambled for transport ships, clogging space lanes and overwhelming station systems. Governments that had enjoyed centuries of peace suddenly realized they had no idea how to fight. Then the humans arrived. The first sign was a ripple in space, a gravitational disturbance that every sensor grid in the conquered core territories picked up simultaneously. It was not a small ripple. It was the kind of disturbance that happened when a star collapsed or when something very, very large moved through faster than light travel. Then the sky broke open. 3,200 ships exited FTL in a single synchronized flash. They appeared across a wide front, filling sensor screens from one end of the core territories to the other. The light from their arrival was visible on the surfaces of nearby worlds, a brief blinding cascade that turned night into day for a full second. Every communication channel in the Conquered fell silent. Ships were enormous. The smallest were stealth destroyers, sleek and dark, running without transponder signals. The largest were the 12 Extinction-class super carriers, each 15 km from bow to stern, bristling with weapons arrays and launch bays that could deploy thousands of drones. Between them were battle cruisers with heavy armor plating, sea platforms carrying weapons that no one had ever seen before, and carrier dreadnoughts whose hangars alone were larger than most species' capital ships. None of these ships existed in any Conquered registry. No intelligence agency had ever detected them. No spy satellite had ever photographed them. They had been built in secret, crewed in secret, and hidden in the empty spaces between stars for decades, waiting for a day that most of the galaxy believed would never come. The human diplomatic broadcast went out on every open frequency. Ambassador Vasquez's voice was calm and clear to all member species of the Galactic Concord. This is the United Terran Armada. We have confirmed the collapse of the Pale Boundary and the advance of the Vrathe Dominion. Do not evacuate. Do not scatter. Hold your positions and protect your people. We are here and we intend to fight. The reactions came fast and none of them were calm. The Relari, species known for its intelligence, Networks was furious, their spy master. A slender creature with 4 eyes and a mind like a steel trap threw a data tablet across her office when she saw the sensor readings the Relari had spent centuries monitoring every species. In the Concord, they had agents on human stations, taps on human communication lines, and analysts dedicated to tracking human military capability. All of their reports said the same thing. The humans had a small defensive fleet of about 200 ships, nothing more. They had missed 3,000 warships, 3,000. The spy master demanded answers from her. Analysts, none of them had any. The Gorvan Collective, a species of large, heavily built reptilians who maintained one of the strongest navies in the Concord, reacted differently. Admiral Tethic, a veteran of 40 years of military service, studied the sensor data in silence for a long time. He examined the ship designs, the formation patterns, the weapon signatures. When his officers asked for his assessment, he said only one thing: these are not patrol ships, these are not defense ships, these are ships built to kill. Fleets, the smaller species, the ones with limited militaries and soft home worlds, reacted with something close to religious relief. The Pelani, a peaceful species of avan creatures, had been preparing mass evacuation of their entire civilization when the human fleet appeared. Their prime speaker reportedly wept on the floor of their parliament, but beneath the relief there was something else, something quieter and more complicated, because the question that every species was asking, even as they celebrated the arrival of a fleet that might save their lives, was simple: how did the humans hide this, and more importantly, why? The answer, though most species would not learn it for years, was rooted in something that aliens found very difficult to understand about humanity. Humans remembered. They remembered ice ages that had nearly killed their species. They remembered plagues that had wiped out half their population. They remembered wars where they had turned their most brilliant minds toward the invention of weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash. They remembered standing on the edge of extinction, not once, not twice, but over and over again throughout their history, and they had learned a lesson from all of that suffering, a lesson that was carved into their bones and woven into their instincts. The lesson was this: peace is wonderful, but peace does not last, and when it ends, the species that survives is not the one that hoped for the best, it is the one that prepared for the worst. So they had prepared quietly, patiently, for 200 years, while they smiled and traded and negotiated with the galaxy. They had built the most powerful military force any single species had ever assembled, not because they wanted war, but because they knew with the certainty of a species that had almost died too many times that war would eventually come for them, whether they wanted it or not. And now it had come. Admiral Marrero stood on the bridge of the Prometheus and studied the tactical map. The Varathi swarm was 17 cycles away and closing fast. The Strathmore corridor, a narrow band of navigable space between the collapsed boundary and the first Hearthworlds, was the obvious choke point. If the Virae could be stopped anywhere, it would be there. He gave the order. The Ember fleet moved. 3,200 ships turned as one and burned toward the corridor at maximum speed. Their drives left trails of blue-white light across the darkness, long bright streaks That could be seen from nearby systems. It looked like a river of stars flowing. Through the void, the Conquered watched them go, the Shield Phalanx admirals, still arguing over command structures, slowly fell silent as they realized something important. The humans were not asking for permission, they were not waiting for a vote, they were not requesting coordination or support or approval from anyone, they were simply going to war, and there was nothing in the galaxy that was going to stop them. On the bridge of the stealth destroyer Nightfall, Captain Ren Akifer watched the fleet formation on her tactical display and felt something she had carried her entire life finally click into place. She had been born on a hidden station. She had been raised by officers. She had trained every day of her life for a battle that she had been told might never happen. Now it was happening, and she was ready. She looked at her crew, 40 men and women who had never set foot on Earth, who had never seen a sunset or felt rain on their faces, who had given up normal lives to serve in a fleet that the galaxy did not know existed. All stations report ready, her first officer said quietly. Aker nodded. Take us to the front. The Nightfall vanished into the dark, running silent, heading for the place where the war would begin. Strathmore Corridor was a stretch of space roughly 2 light-years wide and 9 light-years long, a narrow lane of stable space squeezed between two regions of gravitational distortion that made FTL travel impossible. Any fleet moving from the collapsed pale boundary toward the Hearthworlds had to pass through it. There was no other way. Admiral Marrero arrived 3 days before the Vathi did. He used every hour. The Ember fleet spread across the mouth of the corridor in a formation that military historians would later call the Marrero Line. It was layered, not a single wall of ships but a series of defensive rings, each one designed to slow damage and disorient the enemy before passing them to the next ring. The heavy battle cruisers formed the center. The carrier dreadnoughts sat behind them, ready to launch wave after wave of combat drones. The siege platforms anchored the flanks, their massive weapons pointed forward into the darkness, and in front of all of them, invisible and silent, the stealth destroyers waited. Captain Akifer positioned the Nightfall at the very edge of the corridor, so far ahead of the main fleet that she could no longer see their drive signatures on her sensors. She was part of a Wolfpack 12 stealth ship spread across a wide front, their jobs simple and terrifying. They were the first ones the Vrathi would meet. They were the bait, the trap, and the knife in the dark all at once. The Varathi Vanguard arrived on the 6th day. Akifer saw them on her passive sensors first, a cluster of 300 ships moving in a tight, swirling formation that looked less like a fleet and more like a swarm of insects. The ships were organic, built from chitin and living tissue, and they pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow that made them look like deep-sea creatures moving through the void. They were scanning ahead with biological sensor organs, searching for threats they did not find. The Nightfall human stealth technology was built on a principle that no other species had mastered: total emission control. The stealth destroyers did not just mask their signals, they produced no signals at all. No heat, no radiation, no electromagnetic noise. To the Vrathas sensors, the Nightfall was a piece of empty space. Akifer waited until the Vanguard was deep inside the Wolfpacks Kill zone, then she gave the order. 12. Stealth ships fired simultaneously. Kinetic lances, long rods of ultradense metal accelerated to a fraction of light. Speed punched through the Varathy. Formation like needles through cloth. The first volley destroyed 40 ships. Instantly, the second volley fired 3. Seconds later, destroyed 30 more. Electronic warfare systems activated. Flooding Vrathi communication. Frequencies with noise and false signals. The vanguard broke apart. Ships scattered in every direction, firing blindly at targets they could not see. Offer's wolfpack moved through them like ghosts, striking and vanishing, striking and vanishing. In 11 minutes, though, engagement was over. 240 Varathy ships were destroyed or disabled. The wolfpack had lost 0. Akifer allowed herself one slow breath, then she checked her long-range sensors and felt the brief spark of victory die in her chest. Behind the vanguard, filling the corridor from edge to edge, the main Varathy swarm was coming. The sensor count climbed past 10,000, then 20,000, then kept going. The swarm moved like a living wall, dense, coordinated, and enormous beyond anything Akifer had imagined. Individual ships were hard to distinguish. The whole mass pulsed and shifted like a single organism. She transmitted the sensor data back to the Prometheus. Admiral Marrero received it without visible reaction. He had expected this. The Vrathi did not send armies, they sent tides. All ships, he said over the fleet channel, stand ready, they are here. The swarm hit the first defensive ring like a wave hitting a sea wall. The space between the two forces erupted in light and fire. Kinetic lances tore through Varathy hulls. Plasma batteries burned ships out of the sky. Combat drones launched from the carrier dreadnoughts and met the Vrath's own drone swarms in a chaotic glittering storm that filled cubic kilometers of space with explosions and debris. The Vrathi pushed forward with mindless, relentless pressure. For every ship that was destroyed, 3 more took its place. They did not retreat, they did not hesitate. They simply pressed and pressed like water finding its way through cracks in a dam. Marrero watched the battle develop and made his decision. He activated the Hellfire engines. 3 Extinction-class super carriers positioned at the narrowest point of the corridor powered up systems that had never been tested in combat. The Hellfire engines were humanity's most closely guarded secret weapons that did not destroy ships but destroyed the fabric of space itself. They destabilized the quantum structure of local space, making faster than light travel physically impossible within a radius of 4 light-years. The effect was immediate and devastating. Thousands of Varathy ships that were mid-jump, trying to bypass the defensive lines and strike at the hearth worlds directly, were ripped out of FTL travel and thrown back into normal space. They emerged scattered, damaged, and completely disoriented. Their navigation systems fried and their formations shattered. The Ember Fleet 2nd and 3rd defensive rings opened fire on the scattered ships. It was not a battle, it was a harvest, but the main swarm, the ships that were already in normal space, kept coming. The Vathahive Admiral, the intelligence-designated Skris, adapted faster than Marrero had hoped. It pulled its forces into tighter formations, sacrificing the outer ships as shields for the inner ones. It sent waves of smaller drone ships ahead to absorb kinetic lance fire before the Capital ships advanced, it was not stupid, it was not mindless. It was ancient and experienced, and it had broken civilizations far older than humanity. The battle became a grind. Hours passed, the defensive rings held. But they bled, human ships began to take damage. A battle cruiser on the left flank took a direct hit from a Vrathi. Acid lance and broke apart, a carrier. Dreadnought lost its hangar bay to a swarm of boarding organisms, the stealth destroyers, now revealed by the chaos of close combat, fought in the open for the first time, their speed and agility keeping them alive, but their ammunition running low. Akefer lost 2 ships from her wolf pack in the first 4 hours. She lost 3 more by the 8th hour. Good ships, good crews, people she had known her entire life, gone in flashes of light that lasted less than a second. By the 12th hour of continuous fighting, the Ember fleet had destroyed over 6,000 Viri ships, but the swarm had barely thinned. The numbers on the tactical display kept climbing as more Vrathi poured through the breach in the boundary, an endless river of kitten and fury, the conquered species watching the battle through long-range sensor feeds sat in stunned silence. They had never seen combat on this scale. The Gorvan Admiral Tethik, observing from his flagship, studied the human tactics with the eye of a professional soldier. The precision, the coordination, the willingness to take losses and keep fighting. He had spent his entire career believing the Gorvan had the finest navy in the galaxy. He no longer believed that. He turned to his officers and spoke words that would be repeated across the galaxy for centuries to come. They told us they were merchants. They lied on the Prometheus Marrow. Study the tactical display. The math was simple and merciless. At the current rate of attrition, the Ember fleet would be destroyed in 72 hours. The Vira would lose 30,000 ships in the process, but they would still have enough left to reach the Hearthworlds. Holding the line was not enough. It had never been enough. Against the Vrathi, history proved that. Then something happened that had never happened before in 12,000 years of recorded galactic history. The Vrathi communicated. A signal cut through the noise of battle on an open frequency, not a weapon, not a sensor pulse, but a message. It came from Skews itself, transmitted in a crude approximation of conquered trade language. The translation was rough but clear. You are new, you fight differently. It does not matter. We are endless. Every ship in the Ember fleet received it. Every crew heard it. For a moment, the weight of those words pressed down on all of them, the cold alien certainty of a species that had been consuming civilization since before humanity had learned to use fire. Marrow read the message on his display. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at his tactical officer. Send them our reply. He said, what reply, sir? Marrow's expression did not change. Activate Phase 2, deep in the halls of the 12 Extinction-class supercarriers systems that had been locked and sealed since construction began to power up. Hangar doors that had never opened began to move, and something new, something they Vira had never seen, something the galaxy had never imagined, prepared to launch. Phase 2 was not a defensive plan. It was the opposite of a defensive plan. When Admiral Marrow had first designed Project Ember decades ago, he had spent years studying the Variathi. He had read every record, every account, every fragment of data that any species had ever collected about them, and he had found a pattern that no one else had noticed because no one else had been looking for it. Every species that had fought the Vrathi had done the same thing. They had built a wall, they had held a line, they had tried to outlast the swarm, hoping that if they killed enough ships the Vrathi would eventually run out. None of them had. The Vrathi always had more. They bred faster than they died. They consumed the wreckage of their own fallen ships and used it to build new ones. A defensive war against the Vrathi was a war of slow, certain death. Marrow conclusion had been simple. You do not outlast a swarm, you break it at the source. Phase 2 was the breaking. The 12 extinction-class supercarriers opened their secondary hangars, enormous bays that had been sealed since the ships were built. Inside each bay, packed in tight rows, were hundreds of unmanned siege platforms. They were called Reaper drones. Each one was the size of a small frigate, fully autonomous and armed with a single weapon, a collapse field core that could erase matter from existence. In a sphere 200 m wide, they were not designed to fight ship to ship. They were designed to fly directly into the heart of a very hive ship and detonate. 1,400 Reaper drones launched in a single wave. They poured from the super carriers like seeds from a broken pod, accelerating to attack speed in seconds. They did not fire, they did not dodge. They simply flew fast and straight into the densest parts of the Vrathi swarm. The first Reaper hit a hive ship, massive living vessel, nearly a kilometer long, that served as a command node for hundreds of smaller ships. The collapse field detonated inside the hive ship's core. The effect was instantaneous. Perfect sphere of nothing appeared in the center of the vessel, and everything within that sphere simply ceased to exist. The hive ship folded inward like paper being crushed and then was gone. The smaller ships connected to it went dark, their coordination shattered and began drifting aimlessly. Then the second Reaper hit, then the third, then 50 at once. The swarm shuddered. Hive ships exploded across the formation. The coordination that had made the Vrathi so devastating, the ability to move thousands of ships as a single organism, began to collapse as node after node was destroyed. Ships that had been acting with perfect unity moments before now flew in random directions, crashing into each other, firing at nothing. But Marrow was not finished. Phase 2 had a second part. While the Reapers tore through the swarm at Strathmore, Marrow split his fleet. He pulled 800 warships from the defensive line, battle cruisers, assault carriers and fast destroyers, and placed them under the command of Vice Admiral Dar Ewan, a small Sharpie woman who had spent 20 years planning operations that she had never expected to actually carry out. Her orders were simple and terrifying: take the strike group through the breach in the pale boundary, enter Vrathi space, and destroy their ability to wage war. Ewan did not hesitate. Her strike group turned away from the corridor and burned at maximum speed toward the collapsed boundary. Within hours they crossed the threshold and entered space that no conquered species had entered in thousands of years. Captain Akefor and the Nightfall were assigned to Yuan strike group as forward scouts. Stealth destroyer slipped ahead of the main force, running dark, and became one of the first human ships to see what lay beyond the boundary. It was worse than anyone had imagined. The Vrathi had consumed everything, every star system, they passed through was dead planets, stripped to bare rock, atmospheres burned away, oceans drained. The surfaces were covered in hive structures, vast organic complexes that pulsed with dim light and churned out ships and drones in endless streams. Afir counted 12 consumed worlds in the first system alone. Her sensor officer, a young woman named Tors, stared at the data in silence for a long time before speaking. How many species lived here? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to, but Afir also found something useful: the Vraths. Coordination, the hive mind that let millions of ships act as one was not magic, it was infrastructure, scattered among the consumed worlds were enormous organic structures, each 100s of kilom across, pulsing with energy. They were nexus nodes, relay stations that carried the hive mind signals across vast distances. Without them, the Vrathae could not coordinate. Without them, the swarm was just a collection of individual ships, dangerous but directionless. Akefer transmitted the data back to Ewan. The Vice Admiral studied it for less than a minute before issuing new orders. The strike group would not waste time engaging Varathi fleets. They would go straight for the nodes. The blitz began. Ewan's 800 ships jumped from system to system, targeting Nexus nodes with ruthless precision. Each node was heavily defended, surrounded by thousands of Varathi ships and orbital structures, but Ewan did not try to fight through the defenses. She used the same tactic over and over. The Hellfire engines aboard her assault carriers would shut down FTL travel in the area, trapping the defenders in place, and then her battle cruisers would bombard the node from maximum range with kinetic lances and collapse field warheads until it was destroyed. It was brutal, efficient, and fast. In the first 48 hours, Yuan's strike group destroyed 11 Nexus nodes. The effect rippled across the entire war. Back at Strathmore, Marrow saw it on his tactical display. Sections of the Vrathy swarm suddenly losing cohesion, ship breaking formation and moving erratically. Some turned on each other, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. Without the hive mind's guidance, others simply stopped, hanging motionless in space like dead things. Marrow pressed the advantage. The remaining Ember fleet pushed forward through the disorganized swarm, and the battle shifted from a desperate defense into something else entirely: human. Ships moved through the broken formation with methodical precision, destroying everything that still moved. Escathris, the Vrathi Hive Admiral, tried to adapt. It pulled forces back from the corridor to protect the remaining Nexus nodes. It reorganized its surviving ships into smaller independent groups that could function without centralized control. But Yuan was faster. She destroyed 3 more nodes before Skris could reinforce them, and each one that fell made the next easier to reach. For the first time in its existence, Skris experienced something that its species had no biological framework for. It had no word for it. It had no instinct for it. It was a sensation that the Vrathi had never needed to develop because they had never lost. It was doubt. Escathris made a decision that no Vrathi commander had ever made in 12,000 years of recorded history. It sent a signal to every surviving ship in the swarm, a single, pulsing command that overrode all other directives. Retreat. The Viri pulled back. Ships that had been pressing forward with mindless aggression turned and fled. Toward the Brereach, Hive ships that had been growing replacement vessel shut down their production and moved to join the retreat. The swarm contracted, pulling away from the corridor like a tide going out. The conquered watched in disbelief. The Relari spy master, who had spent the entire battle in a state of barely controlled fury, sat down at her desk and began writing a classified report. It contained a single recommendation: reclassify humanity. Threat level apex. The Gorvan Admiral Tethik, observing from his flagship, allowed himself a moment of genuine admiration. Then he locked it away and began calculating how many ships his people would need to build to remain relevant in a galaxy where the humans had revealed their true strength. On the Prometheus Marrows, officers expected the order to hold position. The enemy was retreating. The corridor was saved. The Hearthworlds were safe. Marrow gave a different order: all ships pursue full speed. His tactical officer looked at him. Sir, the enemy is withdrawing. We have achieved our objective. Marrow shook his head. We held a line. That is not our objective. Our objective is to make sure this never happens. Again, his voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made every officer on the bridge fall silent. We pursue. We enter Varathi space and we end this. The Ember fleet surged forward, chasing the retreating swarm through the breach and into the darkness beyond. It was then deep in Vathi space that Vice Admiral Ewan found something she was not expecting. Her scouts had reached the center of the Dominion, a region of space where the Nexus nodes were oldest and largest, and there, orbiting a dead star, they found a structure not vira, not organic, but built from metal and crystal and materials that no species in the conquered could identify. It was ancient, beyond measure, covered in symbols that matched nothing in any known database. Ewan sent a transmission back to Marrow. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that he had never heard before. Admiral, the Vatha did not break the pale boundary. Something else let them out. The structure orbiting the dead star was older than anything Vice Admiral Ewan had ever seen. It was older than anything anyone had ever seen. Scans estimated its age at somewhere between 2 and 5 million years, but the instruments kept giving different readings, as if the structure existed slightly outside of normal time. It was enormous, a ring-shaped mega structure nearly 800 km in diameter, built from metals and crystalline materials that did not match any known element. Its surface was covered in symbols, millions of them, etched into every centimeter of its hull in precise, repeating patterns. Power still flowed through its core, dim but steady, like a heartbeat that had been beating for longer than most species had existed. Captain Afir and the Nightfall were the first to enter it. The stealth destroyer slipped through a gap in the ring's outer shell and into a vast internal chamber. The space inside was dark and silent, lit only by faint pulses of blue light that traveled along channels in the walls. A fierce science officer ran continuous scans while the ship moved slowly through the interior, mapping everything. What they found changed the meaning of the entire war. The structure was a control hub, the central node of the pale boundary itself. It had been built by a civilization that the data archives inside the structure identified only as the architects. They had existed millions of years ago, long before any current species had crawled out of its ocean or learned to look up at the stars. They had been powerful beyond comprehension, capable of engineering on a scale that made the conquered greatest. Achievements looked like children building with blocks, and they had built the Varathi. HFY's team found the records deep in the structure's data core. The architects had created the Varathi as a weapon, a self-replicating biological army designed to consume and expand without limit. They had engineered the hive, mined the nexus nodes, the ability to convert any organic matter into new ships and new soldiers. The Varathi were never a natural species. They were a tool built for a war that had been fought and forgotten millions of years before anyone alive today was born. But the tool had turned on its makers. The Varathi could not be controlled, could not be shut down, could not be reasoned with. The architects had tried everything. In the end, they had built the pale boundary, a massive energy barrier powered by this very structure, and sealed the Varathi behind it. Then the architects had disappeared, either destroyed by their own creation or gone somewhere beyond the reach of history. The boundary had held for millions of years, but nothing lasts forever. The structure's power core had been degrading slowly, century by century, and something Yuan's engineers could not determine what had accelerated the decay. In recent centuries, the boundary had weakened, thinned, and finally collapsed. The Varathi had not broken free. They had simply walked through door that had finally rotted off its hinges. But the records contained something else, something that mattered more than anything else in the structure. The architects, knowing that the boundary might eventually fail, had built a failsafe, a kill switch embedded in the control hub systems, a specific frequency that, when broadcast through the Nexus node network, would shut down the Vira hive mind permanently. Every Vira in existence would simply stop, their collective consciousness extinguished in an instant. The kill switch was still functional, but the Nexus nodes that UN strike group had been destroying were the very network it needed to propagate. With most of the nodes gone, the signal would not reach the entire swarm. They needed at least one node, one surviving relay point to broadcast the frequency across Varathi space. Yuan checked her tactical data. One node remained intact. It was the largest and oldest, located in a system 3 light years from the mega structure, and it was surrounded by the remnants of the retreating Vira swarm. Thousands of ships, disorganized but still deadly, clustered around it like antibodies protecting a wound. That was when the Aether appeared. A single ship emerged from FTL near the mega structure, a vessel so ancient that its design matched nothing in any known database. It was vast, dark, and quiet, and it moved with a grace that suggested technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from nature. The Aether had come. They communicated through direct data transfer to the Prometheus, bypassing all normal channels. Their message was long and detailed, but its core was simple. They confirmed everything HFY had found. The architects had built the Varathi. The architects had built the boundary. The architects had built the kill switch. And the Ether had known about all of it for a very long time. Admiral Mer, reading the Aether's message on his bridge, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why did you warn us? Of all the species in the Conquered, why did you choose humanity? The Aether's answer was delivered without emotion, without flattery, and without hesitation. They had watched every species in the galaxy for thousands of years. They had observed their cultures, their militaries, their instincts, and they had concluded that when the boundary fell, only one species would be ready. Not because humans were the strongest, not because they were the smartest, but because humans were the only species that prepared for disasters they hoped would never come. Every other civilization trusted the boundary, or trusted the conquered, or trusted that someone else would handle the crisis. Only humans had looked at the peace they lived in and thought, this will not last, and then spent 2 centuries quietly building an armada in the dark. The other had recognized that instinct. Because they shared it, they too remembered what it was like to nearly go extinct. It was the oldest bond in the universe, the bond between species that had stared into the void and refused to die. Marrow absorbed this, then he turned his attention to the kill switch. The final operation was planned in hours. Marrow brought the full Ember fleet to bear, every surviving ship, over 2,500 vessels converging on the last Nexus node. UN strike group would assault the node's defenses from one side. Marrow's main fleet would hit from the other. HFY and a team of Terran Marines would board the mega structure's control hub and activate the kill switch manually. The battle began at dawn station time, a meaningless distinction in the emptiness of space. But Marrow had always believed that humans fought better when they felt like they were starting a new day. The Vatha remnants fought with the desperation of a dying organism without the full hive mind. They had lost their coordination, but they had not lost their ferocity. Ships threw themselves at the Ember fleet in suicidal charges, boarding organisms latched onto human hulls and tried to eat through the armor. Acid lances burned through shields and scorched the metal beneath. Human ships died. The battle cruiser Resolute was swarmed by hundreds of small Vathi craft and dragged down, its crew fighting to the last. The assault carrier Dawn of Fire took a critical hit to its engine core and detonated, taking 200 crew members and 1,000 combat drones. With it, every loss was felt, every name would be remembered. But the fleet pushed forward through the swarm, through the fire, through the wreckage of fallen ships on both sides. They carved a path to the Nexus node, and when they reached it, they held the line long enough for HFY to do her work. The boarding action was the worst part. HFY led 50 Marines into the mega structure's control hub through a breach cut in its outer hull. The interior was dark, alien, and vast, and the Vratha had infested parts of it of organic growths covering the ancient walls. Drone soldiers lurking in the corridors. The Marines fought through them, room by room, corridor by corridor, losing people at every turn. HFY took a hit to her left arm from an acid spray. She kept moving. She lost her sergeant, a man named Cade, who had been her friend since childhood, to drone ambush in a narrow passage. She kept moving. She kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant that every sacrifice, every ship, every crew member, every person who had given their life in this war would mean nothing. They reached the core. It was a vast circular chamber filled with the blue light of the architect's ancient power system. The kill switch interface was still active, still waiting. After millions of years, a firer connected human systems to the architect technology. Her engineers worked fast, translating the alien interface, aligning the frequency, Outside, the fleet was taking heavy losses holding the perimeter. Marrow's voice came through on the calm as ever. "Captain, we are running out of time." "Almost there," Afir said. Her hands were steady, her arm was numb to her sensor. Officer made the final connection. Afir, the kill switch, the frequency propagated through the last Nexus node and out across Verithy space at the speed of light. It passed through every system, every hive world, every ship, every drone, and everywhere it touched. The Verithy stopped. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no scream, no final act of defiance. The hive mind simply ceased to exist. Ships that had been firing moments before went dark and drifted. Hive structures that had been churning out new soldiers fell silent. Billions of organisms spread across thousands of light years stopped moving. In the same instant, the silence was the loudest thing Afir had ever heard. On the Prometheus, Marrow watched the tactical display as every red icon on the screen turned gray. The war was over. The galaxy did not return to normal. It could not. Everything had changed. The Conquered Assembly convened an emergency session. Representatives from every species filled the chamber, and the atmosphere was thick with emotions that had no easy names. Gratitude and fear, relief and suspicion, admiration and unease. Humanity had saved the Hearthworlds. Humanity had also revealed that it had been hiding the most powerful military force in galactic history for 200 years, while pretending to be harmless traitors. The Gorvan Admiral Tethik addressed the assembly. His words were measured and careful. He thanked humanity for its sacrifice. He honored the crews who had died, and then he said what everyone was thinking: we owe them our survival, but let us not forget they built that fleet in secret in the dark, while smiling at us across the negotiating table. Today they are our saviors. Pray they never become anything else. The chamber was silent. Ambassador Lena Vasquez took the podium. She looked out at the hundreds of species who filled the room, creatures of every shape and size from every corner of the galaxy, all of them alive because of what her people had done. We built it because we remembered what it is like to almost go extinct, she said. We would not wish that on anyone, not even you. She stepped down. Nobody spoke for a long time. Captain Akifer returned to Earth for the first time in her life. She had been born on a hidden station, trained in a secret fleet, and had fought a war across the stars. She had never felt soil under her feet or wind on her face when her transport landed, and she stepped outside. The sunlight was so bright that it hurt her eyes. She stood in a green field under a blue sky, and breathed air that tasted like grass and rain, and she understood finally what she had been built to protect. Adher sent one final message before disappearing into silence once more. It was addressed to humanity alone, and it was brief. You were the right choice. Do not make us regret it. And in a classified facility deep beneath the surface of Earth, Admiral Kale Marrow sat alone in a dark room reading intelligence reports that no one else would see for years. The architects had not only built the Varathi, the data from the megastructure revealed references to other projects, other weapons, other containments, other boundaries scattered across distant regions of the galaxy. The pale boundary had been only one lock. There were others, and some of them were failing. Marrow closed the report. He opened a new file on his terminal and stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then he began to type. The file header read, Project Ember II, the galaxy was safe for now, but Marrow knew better than anyone that peace was a pause, not a promise, and humanity would be ready. They would always be ready because that was what humans did. They remembered and they prepared, and God help anything that came for them next.